noises or something in the background, Alice will interrupt and let me know that she's just muting everybody so that we can hear what's going on. That might include me. You know, maybe she wants to mute me. She does that from time to time. Okay, so here's the you know, quick little guide if you haven't worked with WebEx before. We're going to try and leave the lines unmuted, but as I said, if you can mute your own, that might be helpful to kind of keep things clear. There's a chat feature in the lower right-hand side. If you don't see it, you can up on the upper right, you can click the chat box, and sometimes it's useful to leave a question for Sue or myself or Beth, and we can pick up and we'll monitor that during the presentation. If you send your chats out to the entire group, then that'll be helpful. You can click on it, you see everyone. So that will do that. As we're kind of going through, I'll stop every once in a while as best as I can and see if there's questions along the way that people want to ask over the audio, and so we'll do that. Let's see. This is a kind of a preliminary, pre-webinar, pre-workshop webinar, and the people who will be delivering the material in the workshop in a couple weeks are Sue Mohrman, myself, and Beth Gunderson. You can read a little bit about our backgrounds here. Some of you know us already. There's a lot of friends on the call, I can tell, and for those of you that are new, this kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of the work that Sue and Beth and I do in org design, and specifically for this workshop, talking about some of the more advanced issues in organization change. Let's see. Click on the right button and make it work there.
Chris, this session will be recorded. So
we're going to record this one? Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So
I had a few requests for it, so yeah.
Okay, great. No problem. Just by way of context, to sort of set things up, the way that Sue and Beth and I have been sort of talking to each other and talking to other people about this workshop, it sort of starts with an acknowledgement that you know, the world that we live in, the environment that organizations are operating in, are just getting crazier and crazier. The technological changes are happening faster. The political and social changes just seem to be, you know, kinds of tidal waves coming over us. The competitive changes, disruptions that are happening both technologically and competitively as new organizations into the market or whatever. All of that just sort of seems to be pounding away at organizations, and whether you want to call it a VUCA, you know, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous kind of thing, or any other particular way of thinking about it, all of those things seem to be just ramping up. You know, as we talk with people through the org design workshop, or as we talk to sponsors at the center, everybody's just really busy because the amount of change that we're sort of is being foisted on us is just so high. So it's happening from all kinds of perspectives. And what we noticed several years ago was some concerns that organizations weren't, you know, the capacity to handle this change just wasn't up to snuff. It wasn't able to handle this much complexity, this much change all at once. And in fact, as you talked about it, as we talked about it with different people, what we noticed was that all this new way of thinking about change, all this simultaneous complex change, most organizations were using change management models that were really, you know, developed in the 1950s. they tended to think about change as a project. They tended to think about, you know, let's do one change at a time. We used to talk about transformations, and, you know, the transformation would last a couple of years. Now it's like I go into an organization and, you know, we talk about, oh, we're in an HR transformation. Oh, how's that going? Well, we're in our 5th year. And so the notion that the organizations seem to be in continuous and constant transformation, which, you know, doesn't make any sense if you understand the nature of the word. So it began to occur to Sue and I and Beth that, geez, the change models, the change processes, the change approaches that we have to dealing with what's happening in organizations just doesn't fit anymore. And those models have in many ways, sort of run their course. They're just not as useful as they used to be or were useful. And let's start thinking about a different way of changing. Let's start looking at what organizations are doing, the ones that are being successful, the ones that are not being successful, and start pulling up and talking about the approaches people are using that seem to be working better than the old traditional models. And so that's what we want to position this workshop. We want to position this workshop as an opportunity to present and discuss a variety of ways of thinking about changing in this new this new normal, as you might think about it. For us, and for many of you, this is not a surprise. For us, it starts with sort of thinking about organization design. We see, you know, what people are living through as a function of what they're living in. They're living in an organization design. And so we like to talk about design from 2 perspectives. There's the notion of design as a process. How do we think about the way that an organization evolves and grows and develops over time? And from a design perspective, what we're trying to do in that process is understand how the organization is putting together strategies, structures, systems, processes, reward systems, leadership development initiatives. How are we putting those things together so that we are in service of or trying to achieve financial outcomes, you know, customer satisfaction and loyalty, employee engagement, you know, career development, as well as social outcomes, you know, being a good member of the community, being a good steward of the environment. These are, you know, increasingly are increasing demands on the organization. So we start talking about design from a content perspective. You know, what is the organization design? That's a noun, and we talk about how the organization is put together. But we also want to talk about this process side. We want to talk about the way an organization changes this configuration of strategy, systems, processes, the way it changes how it recruits, develops, and retains people, the way it adopts technologies, the way it innovates over time and develops new strategies, new products and services that obsolete the old ones, and how do we make the transitions between those things. So design still represents for us the context. Because it's a whole systems view. We want to look at everything together as a whole and recognize that these multiple systems are working together. In that sense, our belief is that the world needs a sort of a different way of looking at things. We need evolved ways of organizing. And Jay Galbraith's STAR model has been a key foundation, and it remains a key foundation of the way we think about org design. But as the amount of change has you know, increased, as the complexity and the simultaneity of the change has increased, we've had to move from thinking about an organization and the way it's designed and structured to thinking about designs that are associated with agility. And so we want to think about traditional designs and designs of agility and how we look at those things. We need different ways of thinking about design, not just the designs that are focused on alignment for a particular period of time, but organizations that think about agility and realigning over time. We also have to think about new ways of changing. We have to think about how do organizations develop. How do they become agile, right? How do we use the STAR model and the self-design or the redesign flow at the top row of this slide? How do we use those tools to become agile? And then when you become more agile, when your organization starts to operate in an agile way with simultaneous, discontinuous, complex change, what's the process of change inside of an agile organization? And so we had to start thinking about new ways of defining change. So over the course of the workshop, we're going to be playing with these notions, right? How do we change an organization and move it to a more agile design? And then how do we evolve our ways of thinking about change from one state to another to a constantly evolving state? So I wish I could tell you that this was going to be a really, really simple class and that Sue and Beth and I were going to spout all kinds of silver bullets to tell you to walk away and here's all the things here's the 3 things you got to do and it'll be over. But the truth of the matter is we're talking about a really complex set of issues, and we need a set of models that help us explain the tensions between changing and being more agile on the one hand and continuously changing with multiple changes on the other. So we're going to be playing with that tension a lot during the course of the workshop. What I want to do now is, as a precursor, as a pre-webinar to the workshop, is talk about some of the foundation models. I want to talk and just review quickly the STAR model and the STAR model of organization design, because that's kind of the foundation. With the start there, we have to understand what that is. I also want to talk a little bit about the upper right, the way we redesign organizations today and how we think about that process of redesign. And then lastly, I want to just take a peek into what we call the engage and learn model in the lower right-hand side. What Sue and I noticed as we were talking to organizations that were going through redesign after redesign after redesign was they had to start thinking about changing in a different way. They couldn't just go, they couldn't go in some linear step. One redesign started, and no sooner had it started than another redesign was started, either in the same organization or a different function, or multiple functions were reorganizing all at once, or we were digitalizing on the one hand and somebody else was trying to become more customer-centric and somebody else was trying to institute agile methodology over in the software and the IT groups. So multiple changes were going on, and we had to start thinking about new ways of portraying the way organizations do this complex change, and so we want to talk a little bit about that model on the lower right. We're going to sort of reserve talking about agility at the workshop itself. I think once we get a good grounding in org design, moving to agility becomes a pretty straightforward idea as we look at all the parts. So I'm just going to walk through the STAR model, the redesign flow in the upper right, and then the engage and learn model for people. Any questions at this point? I don't know if you saw Alice Yadira down in Panama is having trouble hearing. I don't know if you can help her out. But any questions before I kind of dive into a couple of these models that people might have? Again, feel free to type in a question in the box, or if you absolutely feel the need, by all means interrupt me. I don't mind at all. Oh, okay.
Hey, Chris, this is Beth. I'm here tonight.
Beth, we can't hear you.
Beth, you're breaking up. Yeah.
that I was finally able to join after my computer. I'm now with you on my phone. So, can you hear me? Just know that I'm on.
Okay. Hi, Beth. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Okay, so the first model, again, kind of what we see as the foundation model, is Jay Galbraith's STAR. And the STAR model sort of has a couple of sort of fundamental beliefs. One fundamental belief is that in order to design an organization effectively, you have to be clear about what the strategy is. If you don't know what the strategy is, then any org design will work, right? If you don't know what your strategy is and you like matrix structures, by all means do a matrix structure. But the way we look at it and the way we try and get people to understand it is there's a really central role played by strategy, and it tells the organization, the people in the organization, the direction that we're headed and how we're going to achieve our objectives. So that's the starting place, and you'll see in almost all of our models, the starting place is strategy and the importance of being clear about what the strategy is, and then sharing that model so that people can have the opportunity to connect to it and make a line of sight sort of judgment about what is my responsibility and how do I connect to creating the conditions, approaches, and doing the work that's going to add value for customers and employees and the environment and that sort of thing. So we very much start with the notion that strategy is crucial and it has to be cleared and shared. And it's going to talk about we're going to go this way, this is how we're going to do our objectives. Once you have that notion kind of clear in your head, the idea of design says there are different components to the way an organization adds value. The first component is its work processes and capabilities. And so the work processes and capabilities in an organization are the things, are the key tasks and activities that add value. So if I said, hi, where do you, tell me about where you work. What does your organization do? And sort of the answer to that question is where you would start with respect to work processes and capabilities. What does your organization do? It designs, develops, and distributes products. It's a manufacturing organization. We take other people's designs and we manufacture it. We're a service organization. We provide different kinds of financial services. Whatever the answer to the question is, tell me about what your organization does. That's kind of a pretty good starting point to talk about the work processes that add capability. The work process that add value, sorry. And capabilities is a little broader statement in that it begins to talk about not just the work that adds value, but it's more about how all of these pieces of the STAR work together to create an organization that can enter new markets well, develop leaders really well, develop new products really well. And those capabilities require structure, management processes, rewarding people. So capabilities is a little broader concept, but we like to put it in there because it's so related to work processes and it's so related to the strategy. And work processes and capabilities kind of give you a picture of what the strategy is really looking like. That's what the strategy looks like in real life, is what are people doing that add value and going to market with their customers in their markets and their segments to add value for these different stakeholders. The core and lateral structure, these represent this sort of bubble on the STAR, this element of the STAR, represents what we call this core structure. So if you think about your senior executives, the CEO in your organization, who are the direct reports? And how are those direct reports what's the logic behind those direct reports? You have functional structures, you have product structures, you have regional structures, you can have matrix structures. Those are kind of the three big ones, right? Functional, product divisional, strategic business unit kind of structures, and matrix. Those are probably the three biggest ones. But you also have process structures and front-back organizations. There's different variations on these ideas. But we want to be sure that we're clear about the options that we have with respect to these different structures. A second piece that is really important, and it's really going to be important when we talk about change, is the extent to which the organization can coordinate itself laterally. Here in Europe, they use the word transversal. So it's about what are the mechanisms, what are the structures and systems and mechanisms we have to break down silos and get groups cross-functionally, cross-business, cross-region to work together. And there's a set of tools in terms of information systems and cross-functional teams and liaison roles that allow organizations to do that. We also want to talk about management processes, whereas capabilities and work processes refer to the work that adds value for customers. Management processes refer to the work that management does to sort of keep the organization together. We have to set goals. We have to allocate resources in terms of budgets. We have to help people make decisions and be clear about who makes decisions. We have to set up communication patterns so that the right information gets to the right person at the right time. This is management work. This is the jobs that managers do to coordinate and set goals and do strategic planning and things like that, which is quite a bit different from the work that the organization does to add value for customers. We also want to talk about rewards, right? What are the incentives that people receive for their work and for their behavior? We can talk about monetary and non-monetary rewards. But the organization needs to be clear about what behaviors, what performance are we looking for, and how will the organization establish a system to link those behaviors and that performance to a set of incentives, again, both monetary and non-monetary. And it's a very powerful system for sort of pulling the organization together and getting alignment among the elements of the STAR. And finally, there's the people. The people part of the STAR sort of looks at the extent to which you recruit, develop, and retain people in the organization. To successfully do that, you have to be clear about the values of the organization and the values of the people you're trying to bring on board. What kind of skills and knowledge do they have? How are we going to think about those careers? How are we going to think about talent management? How are we going to think about strategic workforce planning? How are we going to think about leadership development? So all of these pieces of the STAR should be working together. Should be working together in service of the strategy, in service of the objectives of the organization. And as we think about complex organization change, this becomes kind of the foundation. We have to be able, these are the things that are going to need to change over time, and they need to change in alignment with each other in order for the organization to effectively implement the strategy and achieve the objectives of the corporation. So we see this as a foundational element, a foundation part, and throughout the workshop, you're going to hear us come back to this model all the time because almost any change inside the organization is going to be affecting one or more of these elements of the STAR. So that becomes a kind of a core and foundational model that we've got. Okay? I will move on to the second model that we'll be talking a lot about. And if I had to choose a model that really sort of frames the whole workshop, I think this would be it. Because as you think about any particular change inside of an organization, any particular change is going to affect the design. And probably the best way to think about this is this redesign flow. Again, it starts with strategy. We have to know where the organization is going, how we want to achieve our objectives, the aggressiveness with which we're going to be investing and moving, how much risk we want to take on. We want to know, how broad of a product line or how many markets are we going to go into. We want to know about how we're differentiating ourselves from our customer or from our competitors. So it begins with the strategy and understanding the direction that we're headed. What we've noticed, and this is based on some research that Sue and Tom Cummings did, what we noticed is that organizations that go through a successful redesign tend to use these 3 or 4 buckets of activity. Ideally, you'd go through the redesign process kind of in the direction that it's laid out, but a lot of times organizations are running so fast, they may start in different places. But if we think about kind of a logical flow here, as you get clear about your strategy and you think about redesigning the organization, one of the things you want to do is get really clear what we call lay the foundation. And laying the foundation, has sort of 3 components. We want to be clear about the values of the organization. What are the valued outcomes we're looking for? Could be, different kinds of financial performance, market share. It could be relationships, to the natural environment or our communities, corporate or social responsibility issues. So we want to be clear. We also want to be clear about the values as people. What does the organization believe in, right? And so I tap into the culture of the organization, understand what is it that we hold dear? What is it that we believe is the right way to organize and do things? What kinds of values are in use in the organization that we want to leverage because it's part of our history and our legacy and the things we want to carry forward. It's also possible that there's some values you want to add that you believe need to be changed, and this would be the place to talk about those. We want to get what I call collectively smart. We have to learn. We need to learn that there's multiple ways of designing organizations and changing them. And many organizations have too narrow a view of the options available to you with respect to designs and designing. And so I think one of the big parts of this workshop is expanding your toolkit with respect to, different ways of thinking about design and designing. So we want to learn, do a little learning, and help the organization get a little smarter about the options that it has. And then we want to be sure that we diagnose. We want to understand the existing organization, the existing organization design with respect to the desired strategy so that we understand sort of the gaps between, what kind of an organization do we have and what kind of an organization do we need in order to execute that strategy. That diagnosis then leads directly to a really critical piece, which is called the design criteria. And design criteria tell us about that gap. They tell us what does the organization need to be able to do differently? What kinds of things does it need to, what kinds of capabilities does it need to add to its repertoire so that it's able to carry out and execute the strategy? So this is a little bit of a visioning exercise that sort of says, let's look forward to the time when the strategy is executed and talk about what can the organization do? What are its capabilities? What are the capabilities it needs? And we often talk about this in terms of completing the sentence, we need an organization that can, do what, sort of fill in the blank, right? And so criteria become a really important piece of the organization, of the redesign process, because it tells you the kind of organization that you need to build. The second, so maybe the third or fourth step here in the process is actually designing the organization. And here we go directly to the STAR model. And we say at this point, what needs to change with respect to our work systems and capabilities, our structures, core and lateral, our management processes, our rewards, and our people. Let's specify how those changes what changes need to be made, and how those new specifications that we're describing, how those fit together in service of the strategy. So we want to look at that alignment. We want to look at how things are supporting each other with respect to the design criteria and the strategy. That's the new organization we want to put in place. And lastly, there's an issue about execution and assessment. Sort of, you know, let's put that thing in place. Let's staff the new organization the way it needs to be staffed. Let's adapt the technologies we need to staff. Let's start up the new plants that need to get started up. Let's change the structures that need to get changed. Let's change the reward systems. Let's shift the management processes and strategic planning processes and budgeting processes so that they begin to reflect the design criteria and start putting those things in place and executing on the change so that we make all these alignments you know, come to bear, become reality. And obviously, this is where we're going to spend a lot of time, because what we think is, what we see happening in organizations is you're not just implementing one redesign, you're implementing multiple changes, and there has to be an orchestration that sort of goes on. So if I just take one step here, I keep pushing the down arrow on my computer. It's a bad habit. I want to just kind of explicitly tie the STAR model to the redesign flow and begin to show that these models are very closely related. They both obviously begin with strategy. The STAR model is invaluable when you're diagnosing the current organization against the strategy. The criteria reflect that diagnosis, right, or where the gaps are, and describing the kind of organization that we need to have in order to be effective. Obviously, in designing, we're going through that and specifying how the organization needs to change in a variety of different ways, and looking to specify alignment among those pieces as we're sort of bringing the new design, making it sort of concrete for people. And the implementing and monitoring section also uses the STAR model. We want to begin to ask people, to what extent do you see the structure changing? And is it changing in the right way in accordance with the criteria? Do you see the new goal-setting processes as being appropriate for the kind of organization? So the STAR model still becomes important in the monitoring and assessing phase here during implementation, because it keeps giving us a framework, a common language with which people can make sense of how the organization is changing, and is it changing in ways that are in alignment with the criteria and the strategy. So there's a very strong set of relationships here between the redesign flow and the STAR model. And that becomes, again, kind of a very foundational way of thinking about organization change. The challenge before us now, though, is to say, okay, I'm looking at this organization, I'm looking at the way it's changing, and I've got, you know, a number of changes going on. And we've been defining those changes in terms of work processes and structures and people processes, and thinking about the organization itself and how it's changing. That assumes that we know and understand all the changes that are going on, which tends not to be true. There's a lot of other changes that are going on inside the organization. Even as the organization is redesigning, you know, new products are being rolled out in the organization, our existing markets. New skills, new people are being brought on board and taught about the new ways of working. And the people who have been there a long time have to be brought along to the new ways of working. So there's a bunch of changes that are happening all at the same time, and they may be related to a particular redesign, but they may also be related to other parts of the business. And again, what Sue and I started noticing was that the traditional change management models, the kinds of models you would see in the implementing and monitoring box, were barely able to handle just the one change in terms of the organization and how it's redesigning itself. But most of those models were unable to handle, oh, we're also doing a systems conversion. We're swapping out and implementing a new HRIS. We're going into China a big way now. Those kinds of changes, were in addition to the kinds of changes that were associated with any particular redesign. So how do you think about change inside an organization where a lot of things are changing all at the same time? Excuse me. And this is what got us to thinking, where our current models just don't seem to be able to handle this much complexity, this many simultaneous changes, this many disruptive changes all at once. And we started thinking about how we might view change in a different way. And this is when we came up with the Engage and Learn model. And the model it's portrayed here, by the time you get to the workshop, we may have changed this model. This is kind of the way we've drawn it originally. When you get the readings that Alice is sending out, one of the papers will talk about this model, and you'll see this in the paper. But we're also trying to think about what's the right way to portray these activities and these set of issues. So let me talk a little bit about it and try and set up what we're going to spend a lot of time on during the workshop. What we're trying to do is replace a lot of models that could handle one change at a time. We think the Engage and Learn model is a way of thinking about how to handle multiple changes all happening at the same time. The model is intended to help you think about how all of those different changes can and should be integrated and orchestrated. And what it begins with, with this particular, let's see, it doesn't do it. It doesn't do it. There's an animation that's here that WebEx won't let me do. But in the center of the model, it's got the word engage. And what we mean by that is it's not engagement, right? It's thinking about intentionally doing the 4 activities that are surrounding on the outside of the model: awareness, design, tailoring, and monitoring. We think organizations and people inside of organizations are doing is they're intentionally going around and trying to understand and be aware of what's happening. They are intentionally thinking in the organization about all the different design possibilities, all the different changes that are happening and how they might affect the design, all the different design changes that are happening and how they're going to affect other changes happening inside the organization. So there's a real alignment function that happens in the design bubble here, right? You're thinking of all these changes and how they affect the design of the organization and how the design affects the changes. So you want to see those relationships together so that you can orchestrate them and help the organization make sense of all the changes that are taking place instead of all the changes hitting the employees like one big tidal wave. We think people in the organization should be intentionally engaging in activities that tailor the changes that are taking place, right? What we know is that if you're benchmarking in your organization and you see a Lean Six Sigma process that's happening in another organization, you say, that's a great process, I think we should adopt that. As the organization begins to adopt that Lean Six Sigma process, one of the things you realize right away is you can't adopt it and cut and paste it from one organization to yours. It has to be fit and tailored and customized to your culture, your history, your language, your locations. And so what we notice is that any particular change has to be customized. It has to be tailored. It has to be, you have to make it your own by fitting it to your particular situation. So we think people inside of organizations should be intentionally thinking about, how do I make any particular change fit with our culture, our identity, our way of doing things, our history, and working to make those changes your own, not somebody else's. And the more you do that, the less likely people are to resist the change, because we're doing things our way. And then lastly, we think organizations and the people inside organizations should be monitoring, should be intentionally thinking about, is this working? How can I quickly gather some data, some information, pulse the organization, and begin to ask questions? Do people see the changes that we're doing as working? Are people seeing these changes as moving us in the right direction? And trying to find as quickly as we can, whether or not any particular tailored change is actually meeting its objectives or moving the organization in the right direction. So we see awareness, designing, tailoring, monitoring, right? We see these as 4 activities that are happening simultaneously. It's not like and the reason we keep talking about changing this diagram is, I think it's too easy in this diagram to think there might be some linear process, right? So I described it as awareness, design, tailoring, and monitoring. I went in a sequence. And that's misrepresenting what we're trying to think about, and that's why we're trying to think about a different way of portraying this model. All 4 of these activities, I'm going to go backwards now just to make sure we don't talk about it in a sequence. Monitoring, designing, tailoring, and awareness. All 4 of these are happening at the same time. All right? And the more you do this, the more you intentionally engage in these 4 activities, the more you start to worry about what's happening in other parts of the organization, what's happening in the environment, what are other departments doing. I have some responsibilities for several of the changes. How am I tailoring those to make them fit with our culture and history and strategy? How am I aligning what we're doing in my changes with the other changes that are going on, so that we're designing an organization that continues to fit itself together and not bombard people with 6 different changes that are unrelated? And how do I inquire with people and talk to people and try and understand the extent to which those changes are working or not, right? The more that you engage in these 4 activities, we think the more you learn. Remember back in the redesign flow, learning. The more you learn about how to do these things, the better you get at it. The better you get at it, the more complex and simultaneous change you can take on as an organization as people begin to integrate these 4 activities. So this becomes, in our mind, the way you design, implement, and monitor how the organization operates once it becomes more agile. So we have to become a more agile organization. We need the STAR model and the redesign flow to help us become agile. And then we need to think about, how do I change? How does an organization change when there are multiple changes taking place all at the same time? Some of them are very incremental. Some of them are very disruptive. How do I think about pulling all those things together into a coherent whole for the organization? That's the purpose of this model, is to engage and learn in the way we design and think about design and change and align things, how we tailor and align different changes in the organization to fit our particular purposes and cultures and locations. Are we being aware of what's happening, and are we monitoring and assessing and diagnosing what's happening in the organization so that we can continue to keep those changes in alignment as the organization grows and develops? Okay, so that's my spiel for today. I'm going to stop at this point, and we've got a good maybe 15 minutes here where we can entertain some questions, get people's comments on the kinds of things that I've talked about that made sense or didn't make sense, or you might need some more explanation that, we can maybe answer some questions here, but it also might give Beth and Sue and I some clues about the kinds of things to include more in the workshop in a couple of weeks. So how about it? Give me a couple of questions, make a couple of comments, and let's see what we can generate here in the next few minutes. And everyone is now unmuted. Great.
Okay, so this is Heather.
Yeah, Heather, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've got just one quick question. So I think conceptually and intellectually, I get, the concept that you're after in relationship to the model. I guess where it's always a disconnect for me is then practically, how do you get it done? Because that's a lot to juggle all at the same time.
Yeah. And obviously we're going to talk a lot about that in the workshop. We've got a whole series of cases where we think organizations have done either parts of this really well, or in at least in a couple of cases where we think they've done multiple pieces of this really well, and begin to reflect the kinds of things that we're talking about. So, what do we see in terms of the kinds of things organizations are doing to be more aware, or how do they rapidly pulse the organization to find out what's going on quickly? How do we see organizations using design criteria and strategy and culture and values, if I can kind of put those in a little bit of a bundle, how do they use those as kind of a means for controlling the change as it goes around? Because, you can't have a change manager running around telling everybody what to do in a widely dispersed organization. So how can I think about strategy and values and design criteria as a way to actually help people understand the changes they're supposed to make in their behavior? So I think maybe one of the pieces of feedback I hear in what you're saying is, as much as I was trying to explain the models, maybe I could have used a couple of good examples to sort of tie it down and make it concrete.
Chris, this is Beth. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Am I okay? Great, good. So just to Heather's question, and I think, Chris, you mentioned it earlier in the call here, is that we wish we could give you a silver bullet, but this is messy work. I do think, to Chris's point, from the case studies and the real-life examples we can share with you, you'll be able to pick up some good nuggets about how you can actually make this actionable in your organization.
And this is Sue Mohrman, and I was supposed to be quiet during this one, but I don't know if it's in my genetic stock to do that. Just wanted to point out that there will be actually almost a full day around how you build the capability into the organization to do this. It'll look at the kinds of things that Chris talked about, which is, you can no longer do this with a steering team that's watching everything and getting feedback and rolling out, detailed plans and doing those things. You really have to start building it into the people in the organization to know how you deal with change coming at them. Because we thought of the OE discipline in particular as somehow managing change, helping the organization manage change. And Chris has really described a world where you can't manage it, so you have to actually catalyze it.
Got it. Thank you all. That's helpful.
Any data points or cases from new or young organizations who are building in an engage and learn capability? Obviously, when you talk about agile organizations, a lot of times what I would call the usual suspects sort of come up. The Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples and the Amazons. They were founded considerably later than the General Mills, the Nikes, the Kellogg's, and those kind of Gaps, right? Those organizations that have been around a while. So they were able to take advantage of. And so I think there is some advantage in looking at some of the younger organizations because they were started under a different set of assumptions. And they've been able to pick up on and use some of these things, and they can demonstrate some of those things. I do think it's worth going back and looking at, you know, some of the more organizations that you would call more traditional, the industrial types of organizations, because once you look at those, you see the barriers and you see the assumptions that are built inside of the organization, and that becomes the place where you want to, you know, look to, I'll use the word attack, right? It's those assumptions that are really holding the organization in place, and if you want to move to a more flexible, agile, nimble, continuously changing organization, you need to sort of call out and surface those assumptions that are pretty, you know, pretty buried in the organization's psyche. I think looking at old organizations and comparing them to some of the new ones actually helps you understand how to make that transition to a more engage and learn kind of organization. And I certainly hope we've got old and new organizations that we'll be talking about. We've got some financial services, we've got healthcare. Beth's going to talk about her experiences with General Mills and the things that they've been going through. So we've got a number of different kinds of organizations, and we'll actually have a live case of an organization that is trying to go through that process now. So I hope we've got a pretty good range of subjects for you to play with and chew on and talk about.
Okay.
What else? Anything else on people's minds before we do a little wrapping up? This was, again, I want to come back and remind you, this was we just wanted to expose you to some ideas, get some vocabulary out there so that when we hit the ground running on Tuesday morning, some of these ideas and models and vocabulary will not come at you completely out of the blue. And we can sort of dig in and make the best use of our time for 2.5 days while we're in San Francisco. But any other questions? Beth, Sue, any final comments?
No. Looking forward to the session.
I would agree. Looking forward to meeting all of you.
Absolutely agree with that. Really looking forward to this. This is a fun workshop because we're talking about stuff that's very current and it's on people's minds, and we're talking about stuff that not a lot of organizations have figured out how to do. So let's engage in our own learning and give ourselves an opportunity to play with some of this stuff and bring back some cool what did you say, Beth? Nuggets, some cool nuggets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. Very good.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for coming in.
Thanks, and bye.
See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.